Our next speaker is Dr. R.J. Snell. He is the director of the Center on the University and Intellectual Life at the Witherspoon Institute in Princeton, New Jersey. Prior to that, his coming to Witherspoon, he was for several years a professor and director of the philosophy program at Eastern University and the Templeton Honors College, where he founded and directed the Agora Institute for Civic Value and the Common Good. He earned an MA in philosophy at Boston College and a PhD in philosophy from Marquette University. Research interests include the liberal arts, ethics, natural law theory, Thomas Aquinas, the Catholic intellectual tradition, and the work of Bernard Lonergan. He is the author of various books and articles. He and his family reside in the Princeton area.
Well, good morning to all of you. Really delighted to be here. While I've been to Salt Lake many times, I've never been to Brigham Young. So I was delighted to be here and see the campus and wander around a little bit and to enjoy the extraordinary hospitality of the staff and friends of the Wheatley Institution. So thank you so much, Emily and Richard and others, for having me here, including to your donors and faculty and fellows. Witherspoon has for many years now benefited from our partnership, not only with individual members of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, but also from various leaders of the church. And so it's a real honor for me to be able to, in some small way, contribute to that conversation and to the church's institutions for which we have such great respect and from which we've benefited so much. So thank you for that. You have all, I expect, even if you don't want to admit it in a religious context, experienced sexual desire in its untamed animal form, that undifferentiated urge ordered merely to satisfaction, and a satisfaction aimed at no particular loved body, but aimed rather at any body that could bring relief and satisfaction for that urge. This is animal, and we are animals. You have also, I expect, experienced a focusing of that desire, not just as a tingling desire for anybody, but as the exciting, somewhat delirious focusing towards this body, now not viewed simply as body, but also as person. Now you do not simply desire that body, but you rather desire him or her, and you moreover desire union with them, not just with their body. This is human. This feels like love, like falling in love. Although quite naturally, the desire for the person also desires physical union and not just friendship or conversation. Now, in that context, let me tell you a story. I know you're thinking, please don't. Don't worry, it won't embarrass you, it'll just embarrass me. When I was a college sophomore, I was experiencing the first glimmering excitement of that second kind of experience, that of falling in love, albeit in an initial and undeveloped way. It was for a beautiful fellow student whom I had met my freshman year, and I remember thinking upon first meeting, well, she is rather pretty, isn't she? I should talk to her. Now, of course, her name was Amy, wanted almost nothing to do with me. I know you find that shocking. And while she was polite enough in her quiet spurning, it just wasn't happening. Then, during our sophomore year, she agreed to go out with me on Valentine's Day for a day of hiking and poetry on the Appalachian Trail in the Virginia mountains. Well, this was going great. Here we were reading love poetry, good start, surrounded by beautiful scenery, even better, and it just so happened that she kept slipping on the freshly fallen snow and needing to reach out and steady herself by holding on to my arm. Good, better, best. I mean, slipping once, that could happen to anybody. Twice, she's kind of clumsy. 10 times, slipping and needing to hold on to my arm, she's clearly into me. And with each touch on my arm, my heart is beating, leaping into my chest, and I'm planning the honeymoon and thinking of names for our children. It is going great. And then, at around 5 o'clock, she says she needs to get back to her dorm. Okay, not great, but we've been out here since noon, so the honeymoon is still being planned. And then she explains that she needs to get back in time to get dressed and ready for Valentine's Day date with the man she's seen. What? Well, there went the honeymoon. Horror of horrors, I was just in the friend zone. This wasn't even a date. She was, in fact, just clumsy. And while she liked poetry, she didn't like me. My beating heart was not requited. In fact, I was so not romantic material that she could go out with me on Valentine's Day and that not be thought as a tension with the fact that she was going on a Valentine's Day date later that evening. Pain, disappointed, journaling in my notebooks, writing incredibly bad poetry. You've experienced something like this? I hope not, because it's awful. But you know something of the experience of feeling alone or unwanted or rejected. Why does that hurt so bad? It's not just a sexual desire unmet, not just frustration or a loss of satisfaction, but a loss of love, or a rejection of your person, not just a rejection of your body. It's not just erotic disappointment, it's a loss of the possibility of communion, the communion of persons, the union of persons. Now let's explore that desire for communion for a moment. Turning to the book of Genesis in the Bible to do so. Now, whether you take Genesis as revelation or just a human text doesn't matter, for you can consider the wisdom that it has on offer in the second book of Genesis. Now, if you know the story, it's a beautiful and strange one. Adam, who seems to be perfectly content in the garden, is told by God that it is not good for Adam to be alone. Adam doesn't seem to make this discovery on his own. God makes the declaration that this good, very good world that God has created is somehow not good because Adam is to be alone. You know the story, the animals are paraded by, and none are found fit for Adam. Now, on one reading of this story, which is admittedly somewhat poetic, imagine Adam in the garden. He's been told by God that it is not good for him to be alone, and God is going to provide a helper fit for him. And the animals come by. I sort of imagine Adam being like a child on Christmas morning. There's going to be a gift for him. Something fit for him is coming. And here comes the giraffe. The giraffe is not right for him. Here comes the rhinoceros. This is not right for him. Here comes the platypus. Just keep moving that thing on. Animal after animal after animal come by. And imagine it being a long day and Adam's disappointment growing. This is sort of like college experience if you're trying to date and you're not finding it. They're all platypi coming by. Some of you are looking around like, yes, there's a platypus over there. He tried, but, move on. Imagine Adam becoming disappointed as the day grows long. And just perhaps as your own experience of not finding someone right for you, eventually that turns into not, is there someone right for me, but is it in fact possible that I am not right for anyone? Now, I imagine this as Adam's desire is being trained by God. God is in fact attempting to elicit desire from Adam. Now, as you recall, Adam is put to sleep. We have this whole strange rib scenario. Adam wakes up, and what is Adam's response to Eve? He sees Eve for the first time, and what is his response? At least in some translations, at last. At last, flesh of flesh and bone of bone, here is one like myself and fit for me. Now, if you know the biblical story, they're naked and they know no shame, although very soon after that, he knows her, she conceives. Now, what is the point of this story? As I understand the story, God is giving to Adam a great test. It's a training. It's an education. It's not simply a story. I remember as a child counting ribs and seeing if I had uneven ribs on different sides. It's not simply a story of the genealogy of the human being, of where women and men come into existence. It's a story of the training of God, teaching Adam to become human, and teaching Adam that Adam is fully in the image of God if and only if Adam welcomes communion. The great challenge, which is often not thought of in that story, is that Adam could have said no to Eve. He could have rejected her. He could have awoken from his slumber and said, no, not for me. Find me another. He could have rejected communion. Now, this is the great challenge facing us all. Will we embrace or accept communion? Will we, in the face of another, without shame, say, at last, one like me, equal in dignity and purpose to me, for whom I am? That is a story of joy and communion and the image of God and covenant. It is not good to be alone, for we are meant for communion. We are animals, yes, but we are animals ordered to communion. And so human sexuality is not really about the satisfaction of urges, but rather about the communion of persons, the sharing of selves. Now, the book of Genesis is not at all shy or retiring about the reality of human sexuality. It's shocking that we let children read Genesis, in fact. If anything, the biblical text returns to the theme of sexuality with serious and unflinching attention, nor is there much more moralizing or puritanical tisking about sexuality in Genesis, for sex is far too important, not simply to develop a morality or ethic about what you're allowed to do or not allowed to do, but instead of developing a fundamental anthropology, an account of what it means to be a human being, what we're for, what it's like to be us, created in the image of God. That is, as I read Genesis, it doesn't provide so much an ethical list of rules about what to do. Instead, it provides a profound reflection on desire and sex as a means for the biblical text to give us an account of human nature, who we are and what we're for. And that matters, it seems to me, because too often people who wish to articulate and defend the traditional account of marriage and sexual intimacy speak about it simply under the lens of moralism, as if what is most at stake here is simply avoiding wrongdoing. That's far too minimal of a goal. I'm not minimizing it as a real requirement, but it's too minimal as a goal. What's really at stake in our contemporary accounts of sexuality is a vision of humanity, an account of human purpose and the meaning of life. Just as sex isn't really about the satisfaction of urges, our account of sex shouldn't just be a list of rules about when it's okay or not okay to engage. It should be an account of humanity. Genesis contains the story of Adam and Eve, obviously, a story we know, but it also contains the story of Noah's sons looking upon his nakedness, Abram's repeated attempts to pretend that Sarah is his sister rather than his wife, Sarah's being taken into the harem of foreign kings, the attempted rape of the angels by the men of Sodom, Lot's daughter's incestuous relations with her father, the rape of Dinah, Jacob sleeping with his daughter-in-law. It's just a mess of almost every imaginable sexual distortion, violation, and disorder. And in fact, we see very few happy families in Genesis. We see lots of unhappy, troubled families, with son against father, brother against brother and sister, husband against wife and daughter. The text reveals that sexuality is not some magical, whimsical, beautiful experience that brings people together at all times. It's almost as if the biblical text is showing to us that sex is just as likely to be wild, untamed, uncivilized, and dehumanized. If anything, Genesis shows God's attempt to educate and tame Abraham and his descendants into a new way, a way of order, control, commandment, prohibition, and law. Sex, under God's instruction, is rendered human and civilized rather than animal and wild. And it's no accident that in both the ancient world and in our own, Jews and Christians and Muslims, although not only them, continue their millennia-old attempt to educate pagans into the civilizing and humanizing ways of God. Pagans protest prohibition and demand wildness. Jews and Christians and other people of tradition instead insist that in that way lies death and a loss of human dignity, and in fact that the way of restraint, prohibition, order, and confinement is not simply the way of morals, but more profoundly a way of life and joy and dignity. Our insistence of marriage, husband and wife, as the proper theater in which to act out the sexual drama within a covenantal and loving commitment is not prudishness, it's not killjoy, it's not shame, it is instead joy, life, abundance, and love. It reveals a profound truth about human nature, purpose, and a life well lived. Sure, that sounds good. That sounds very good. And yet we seem to resist it quite a bit, don't we? Not only as persons, but as a society. Let me tell you another story. I've been dating a girl my junior year, and it seems to be getting pretty serious. She was smart, kind, and beautiful. She seemed, for some reason, to really like me, despite having abandoned me the previous Valentine's Day date the year before. It's the same girl. But now it's going pretty well. And then I did something which is very wise. During the summer between my junior and senior year, I lived in Canada, she lived far away. I spent the whole summer thinking about what my future would be, and my future did not include her. But I didn't tell her that. And so I was beginning to imagine a life where I was going to move to Alaska, this is a true story, move to Alaska and become a lumberjack and bear hunter. Now when you look at me, this is the first thought that comes to mind. You think, there's a man who missed his vocation as a lumberjack or bear hunter. But I didn't tell her this. The whole time, long-distance relationship over the phone, I made it sound like everything was going great. I arrived in Virginia. This is going into my senior year, her senior year as well. And I'm picking her up in central Virginia, and we have a 3-hour drive to Charlotte, North Carolina to pick up a friend at the airport as a favor, and then a drive back. We get into the car, we're going to be together for 6 hours. She's very excited to see me, a whole summer apart, going into her senior year. And at about 15 minutes into this 6-hour car ride, where we're going to be locked in the car, I break up with her. After a summer apart, having not told her I had any. You're giving me the dirtiest looks ever. Your face looks very much like her face did. I broke up with her 15 minutes into the trip. Reason being, that she was going to keep me from my true vocation as a wild, free man of the woods, untethered and untamed. That's a true story. I wanted, as so many people in our society do, freedom. And I wanted freedom more than I wanted communion. I wanted to be alone. I wanted to be pagan, wild, not cultivated or really human. And I suggest that for a good many in our culture, in fact, it seems to me for our culture itself, deep in the roots of our culture, freedom is valued more than communion. And that we are in fact now a people in our society that value the dehumanized and the uncivilized more than we value the humanized and the civilized. We're pagans. We are pagan people yet again. Why? How come? Now, it's easy for me to tell the story of Genesis 2, which I take to be beautiful and true. And yet many, so many in our society want to be free, wild, rather than to embrace joy, limits, order, commitment, and communion, tradition, and Western civilization. Our tradition teaches, in an almost unbroken way, that sexuality is properly ordered within a one-flesh union of marriage of man and woman, a comprehensive union open to and ordered to the generation and care of children within sustained family and communal care. But that isn't so obvious or respected by so many in our society. For instance, we have a widespread acceptance of premarital sexual activity. We have a widespread acceptance and use of pornography. We have a rejection of marriage culture. We have a delay of marriage. We have a refusal or limiting of children. We have same-sex marriage. We have gender ideology and transgenderism. We have open relationships. We have a growing fascination with polyamory. The list goes on. Now, what gets us to this place of current wildness, paganism? And how will you respond and articulate a winsome, persuasive response? This is my question for you. How will you articulate a winsome, persuasive response? Now, my understanding of the round table is that you'll be discussing how to communicate and persuade others about the truth of sexuality against the challenge of our age. In other words, we're not simply trying to preach to the choir, we're trying to give you resources so that you can think through and how to develop responses to the culture. Now, the main challenge I suggest is paganism, a rejection of the tradition and its civilizing and humanizing education in favor of a return to the wildness of pagan ways. That's the big challenge, is paganism. Several of my friends and I, our wives tend not to like this. Whenever we celebrate a baptism together in community, in the Catholic understanding, baptism is a move from paganism to Christianity. And we'll celebrate, oftentimes with a good cheer, that there is one fewer pagan in the world. Many of our wives who are holding these darling infants are not so sure that their children are pagans. And I'm quite convinced that they are. They're a pagan, now they're a Christian. They're a pagan, now they're a Christian. Paganism, I think, is the great challenge that you're facing. How will you respond to that? But paganism is too big, it's too undifferentiated, it's too broad. So let me develop, with a bit more precision, 5 specific challenges I see that I think you need to develop responses to. Yes, it's all about paganism, a return to the wildness described in Genesis whenever humans do not know or follow the training and education of God. But I want you to figure out answers to 5 specific manifestations of paganism. The first 2 I'll go through somewhat quickly, and the others I'll develop in more detail. The first challenge, the permissive thesis. Here's how the permissive thesis works. It assumes and gives a definition of the human being as a bundle of desires, urges, and satisfaction. It claims that frustration of that bundle of nerves, desires, urges, and satisfaction, that frustration of those desires is always a source of violence and unrest, and in fact turns into political violence and political idolatry. It then follows with a utopian claim that repression, and repression is understood to be anything which interferes with the unparalleled satisfaction of that bundle of urges. That repression, which some people call self-control, is in fact not a virtue but a vice, and that repression is a source of mental disease, anxiety, unhappiness, and violence, and thus the permissive thesis: any and all repression is bad, any and all repression is unhealthy, and each and every expression is healthy and leads to peace and happiness. Now, it seems to me this governs much of our educational and therapeutic culture. I, in fact, think this is the basic principle of much of our educational and therapeutic culture of our time. Namely, that one is, in fact, harmed by restraint, and one is healed by an exercise of passion. I think that is a huge barrier to respond to, because it's a reversal of all the old values. The old values suggested that restraint was in fact the virtue of chastity, or restraint was the virtue of self-control. That's now understood to be a mental disorder and a source of unhappiness and violence. The book to read here is in fact Wilhelm Reich's book, The Sexual Revolution, from the early part of the 20th century, in which he argues that repression is the source of fascism, and so if you wish to have universal peace and happiness, you have to have sexual expression. That's the permissive thesis. Please find a way to answer that. The second challenge, body self-dualism. Here's how body self-dualism works. I am not my body, I have a body. Myself, the self that I am, is something distinct from my body. I may use my body as I wish, because as I use my body, I am not using myself, because I am something different from my body. Now, the way this really works itself out is in the contemporary debates about transgenderism. I may, in fact, have a biologically male body, but my body is not really myself. My real self is how I understand myself to be, and I understand myself to be alienated from my body or in some other ways distinct from my body, and thus the real self that I am is the one that I understand myself to be, not the one that you see in front of you in an embodied way. It's called body self-dualism. You have to respond to that challenge. How will you give an anthropology which explains how the body is not distinct from the self, but the body really is the self? If we cannot answer body self-dualism, you'll never be able to answer the transgender challenge, it seems to me. Those are the first two challenges, somewhat briefly. The final three I'll develop in more detail. Because the first two are easy to say but hard to answer. The final three are hard to say and still hard to answer. The third challenge is anti-culture, or revolt against sacred order. Anti-culture, revolt against sacred order. Philip Rieff, the great sociologist, once noted that culture is the form of fighting before the fighting actually begins. Cultural work is the matter and manner of disarming competing cultures. That is to say, any culture works to sustain itself by disarming its competitors. But the unique work of culture, say from politics or warfare, is that the weapons of culture are the principles of legitimization and delegitimization, what you're allowed to think around here. If you remember from Plato's Republic, the wonderful episode where the poet coming from the other city comes to the city in speech, and the poet has a form of music and poetry that is not allowed in this particular city. The city sends representatives out to praise the poet, but to tell the poet that his ways of poetry are not allowed in this city. That's what we mean by a principle of legitimization or delegitimization. This is not permitted here. Please go elsewhere. That's what culture does. Now, according to Rieff, we are nearing the end of a great fight over culture. Now, he distinguishes between what he calls first, second, and third cultures. This has nothing to do with economic matters. First cultures are typically pagan and enchanted, often with multiple gods and a thin or permeable barrier between the divine and mundane orders. Order is sacred and guaranteed by taboo. Second cultures for Rieff are generally derived from revealed monotheism. There is a sacred order, and that sacred order is governed and revealed by a self-revealed creator. And the truth of the world is sacred and creedal, but now it is faith rather than fate and providence rather than magic that shows God's active role in the world. Now here's Rieff's claim. Second world culture, you could think of this as Christianity or Judaism. While second world culture limps along in the vestiges of our common life, in its waning days and presence and influence through the remaining Judeo-Christian institutions and norms, it is, thinks Reef, being relentlessly swept away in the fires of a great cultural fight in an emerging and almost entirely victorious third culture. Third culture does not posit nor does it believe in sacred order. Instead, it is radically skeptical of each and any claim to sacred order. So skeptical that one could say that the salient and defining characteristic of third cultures is that is a negation of second culture. Its reason for existing is to deny and negate sacred order in things like Christianity and Judaism. Third cultures are negative cultures. They are destructive. Reef calls them anti-cultures. Now, like any culture, they are interested in maintaining their own way and delegitimizing other ways. And according to Reef, our current skeptical postmodern culture is relentless in sweeping away, deconstructing, critiquing, unmasking, problematizing is a word that academics love to use. We'll problematize something. Problematizing the authorities and authorized identities of second culture. We see this, for instance, in the suspicion about traditional marriage, sexual strictures, gender roles, and cultural norms, even in the rejection of a relation of sex to gender at all. The current masters of suspicion, our guiding elites, are, according to Reef, virtuosi of decreation. They're not so good at building, they are very good at taking apart the structures of second culture. And they are consumed with a passion to view all authority, all sacred texts, all traditions, all inheritances, all moral norms, with at best irony or more likely outright scorn. You know the ironical person? The ironical person makes fun of themselves making fun of a norm. They hold it very loosely. There's always a laugh and a chuckle that someone could be so earnest enough. I remember once visiting a church not of my own communion, I wanted to look at the architecture, and a pastor of the church came up to me and my wife who was there, and they said, "Oh, do you have children?" And I said, "Yes." He goes, "Oh, how quaint, you're still breeders." This is irony. How quaint, you're breeders. But this is, of course, to mock, unmask, and deconstruct an old norm. That's irony at best. Generally, it's outright scorn. Our third culture, our postmodern culture, if you wish, wishes to be emancipated and liberated from traditional order. Emancipated from order, but to nothing. Not emancipated from in order to attain another good. It is simply to be emancipated for emancipation's sake. It is replaced with no other order other than the order of suspicion, unmasking, deconstruction, and critique. In third culture, there does not seem to be any end, any purpose, other than the endless play of roles, gender or sexual roles, for instance, and the shuffling on and off of various identities, each one of those identities a matter of utterly arbitrary choice, none binding, and any obligations, if there are any obligations, are thought to be temporary, contingent, and given to ourselves rather than placed upon us by an authority whose authority is distinct from our acceptance and will. Now, in such a context, each and every moral position cannot but be viewed as arbitrary and known to be arbitrary. And so protest and indignation and outrage cannot but be the normal mode of discourse, political or otherwise. If the other person's position is arbitrary and they're attempting to make it a normal position that I have to follow, but I know their position is arbitrary, you can sense my resistance to them and why I may find protest or indignation to be an appropriate response. Now, of course, in third cultures, it is not merely the other person's moral position which is arbitrary, but so too one's own position is known to be arbitrary and grounded in nothing. And so the attacking and unmasking of the other person's position is in fact a defensive ploy. Most moral discourse, it seems to me, in our time, is really a form of, I know I am, but what are you? It's all defense. If I can attack and unmask your position before you get around to attacking and unmasking mine, then I win. Because I'm able to maintain my own position without any need to defend, articulate, or justify my position. Because the secret is, in third culture, I don't believe I can justify my position. It is an act of will and defiance. It's not grounded in reason or authority or tradition. Consequently, anti-culture tends to be transgressive. It delights in transgressing, to poke and shock and delegitimize and mock and unmask and reveal as arbitrary. Third culture loves nothing more than to yell that the emperor has no clothes before the courtiers of the emperor. Now, such revolt is, it seems to me, endless, never satisfied, which is why the sexual transgressions of our own time never seem to come to an end. What is it that they want? When will they have enough and be satisfied that they've won? It wasn't just that premarital sex needed to be winked at. It wasn't just that divorce needed to become acceptable and no fault. All of that had to continue. It had to proceed to become a celebration rather than mere acceptance of abortion. Then it had to become not merely the acceptance, but the celebration of same-sex marriage. And after that, it had to become the acceptance and then celebration of polyamory, and then transgenderism, and now increasing attempts to rehabilitate pedophilia. And it will be something else next. There is no end point to anti-culture where it declares that it has won and now can come to rest. It will declare that it will win, and then it will continue yet some more. It can never rest in its relentless attempt at a clean sweep to unmake everything in favor of endless and arbitrary wildness. What's next? We don't know. But the revolt will never stop until each and every vestige of sacred order is erased. That's the third challenge. How are you going to answer that? An endless transgressive revolt which will not rest until every vestige of sacred order is erased. If you find an answer to that, I would love to hear it. I await our conversation. The fourth challenge. So the first is the permissive thesis, the second is body self-dualism, the third is anti-culture. The fourth, smuggled catechesis. Catechesis, in the context of my own religion, is the training and doctrinal formation of the young, training of the young. The grand hopes and speculations of the early moments of third culture have all run aground. William Reich's hope for endless peace grounded on sexual license, or Marcuse's liberated society, or Foucault's sexual liberation ran smack into reality. It ran into AIDS and sexual violence and unhappiness, the intense battles between feminists and transgender activists. This is a fascinating debate if you're following this, the TERF battle, TERF, right? Trans-exclusionary radical feminists. And also into the reality of the strange current Victorianism on so many college campuses, where women are simultaneously presented as weak victims, always under danger, while simultaneously supposed to view themselves as utterly emancipated sexual predators. That's a strange Victorianism. But while the positive vision of the radicals foundered, there's no utopia coming around, the negative critiques of their motivations continued. The chipping and poking and dissolving of normativity and authority and thick moral obligation in the sacred. Authority and higher law in the minds of many is vanquished, utterly vanquished. But vanquished too are almost all utopian political visions of the early radicals. Instead, what remains from the early radicals who thought they were going to bring about a kind of sexual utopia in the world is nothing other than the bourgeois demand for comfort, security, an easy conscience, and satisfied well-being. The old Berkeley radicals are utter bourgeois now. All they want is an easy conscience, comfort, and a pair of slippers. Rather than a thick sense of the good life, all of which was critiqued and unmasked, we have instead an easygoing pluralism which asks everyone to live as they please, to live out and seek happiness and satisfaction in whatever manner they see fit. And this because we do not believe as a society in any shared or universal good, and thus we must allow everyone to define their own good for themselves. Now, in sexual morality, this looks a lot like the ethics of consent. On most college campuses, consent is the sexual rule. If you have 2 consenting parties, or 3 consenting parties, or 4 consenting parties, if consent has been met, so too are all the moral and sexual obligations fulfilled. Where if everyone consents, everything's resolved apparently, and it's nobody's business. To each their own, live and let live, love is love, love wins. Isn't that not the sexual ethic of our day and age? To each their own, live and let live, love is love, love wins. Now, such a vision pretends, this is my claim, pretends to be neutral, pretends to let everyone define their own morality and view of life. But that's a deceit. Our culture claims to be liberal and value neutral about these things. But in that very claim of neutrality, it's smuggling in and not admitting that it's making comprehensive claims about what counts as a good life. Our society claims that it does not teach any substantive good about sexuality. Live as you live, love is love, not my business. You define it for yourself. But of course, to declare that love is love and everyone should define this for themselves is already, in fact, non-neutral, but is teaching several thick, comprehensive, substantive claims about human purpose and the human good. For instance, it is teaching that I, am the source of moral value. That is, it's smuggling in the position that subjectivism is true and objectivism is false. The claim of neutrality is teaching that we have no grounds to critique anyone else's choice. That is, it's teaching is normatively true, that relativism is true, and that morality is non-rational, merely an expression of will or preference. This is what some people call emotivism. It's also, in its claim of neutrality, claiming that consent is the limit of sexual morality. That's not a neutral claim. That's a positive and comprehensive teaching that the will is superior to reason and that choice is superior to fidelity. In other words, those are all comprehensive visions of what the good life is. When our society claims that it is value neutral about these things and that everyone is able in their own communities to determine the meaning of things like happiness or sexual morality or sexual license, that is not neutral, that is a positive and comprehensive catechesis, smuggled in under the cover of neutrality that will is superior to reason, choice is superior to tradition, the arbitrary is superior to the non-arbitrary. It's a positive claim. This is not merely secularity, it's a positive teaching that nihilism is true. And so we, and especially our children, are surreptitiously trained. The society pretends it is not training, it's just neutral, it says. It is surreptitiously training under the cover of night and catechizing us and our children into the worldview which is utterly hostile to the tradition, all the while pretending to not teach anything. Nihilism is smuggled in, all the while pretending that nothing is being taught, that we're still free to believe whatever we want. Now, technically that's true, but recall that the catechesis is ubiquitous. It is everywhere. It sneaks up on everyone. And parents and schools and religious organizations which continue to think that they are safe to teach as they wish because the society technically claims to be neutral and to allow them to teach as they want are naive. The real teachers who are catechizing us and our children are television, music, school, colleges, media, entertainment, and the political system itself. And that real system of catechesis is busily and knowingly devouring the souls of our kids while claiming to not teach anything. How will you respond to that challenge? How will you respond to the fact that we and our children are being taught all the time by a cultural curriculum by those who have real power in our society? Don't forget, culture, we've taught, is all about legitimization. And the powers of legitimization occur at the centers of cultural capital. They don't occur at the edges of cultural capital. The centers of cultural capital in our own society are places like Washington, D.C., or New York City, or Hollywood, or Silicon Valley, or the pages of the New York Times or the New Yorker, or the screens of Netflix, or the classrooms of Stanford and Yale Law School and Harvard Business School. Now, you might think that you and your kids are safe in the plains of Nebraska, say, but most, if not all, of the cultural power which will form the tastes and loves and sense of right and wrong and imagination come from sources of legitimization which are far away from Nebraska, but which are steadily and relentlessly insinuating themselves into the thoughts and tastes of our kids. You cannot run away from the space where you're hoping to flee. It is ubiquitous and relentless, and it occurs at the center of cultural capital. And cultural capital determines what your children will believe and taste and feel. Increasingly, religious leaders are aware of this. They know that no matter how much they tell their young, if they're young or on Netflix, the game's up. How will you respond to that? The fifth challenge. Anti-culture is growing fangs. So the first culture was the first challenge was permissive thesis, second body self-dualism, third anti-culture or the revolt against sacred order, fourth was the smuggling in of cultural catechesis, the fifth, anti-culture is growing fangs. Tocqueville judged that the obsession with democratic equality and bourgeois ease would mean that Westerners would quickly sell their freedom in the name of choice and well-being. In fact, the word well-being makes my antennae go up already. There are all sorts of universities and departments at universities which love to talk about flourishing and well-being. For me, that's code word for be aware, because well-being is almost always the most reduced sense of a subjective sense of comfort with one's own life and a new iPhone and GDP. But of course, I understand well-being as the practice of sainthood. That's a different story. Augusto del Noce, who I think you should read, has argued that the threat of freedom in this context will take the form of therapy and re-education. It might not be an overtly hostile political act, might not involve an actual tyrant. It will just occur in the world of therapy and re-education. Since those who hold to the older traditions are thought or judged captive to something arbitrary and counter to freedom, then those who hold to the older traditions, people like me, maybe people like you, are judged to be captive to false consciousness. They need to be helped. They need to be educated. They need to be therapized out of their belief, not a real word. They can't be argued with, but they need a kind of cure. Del Noce writes from the perspective of anti-culture, no dialogue is possible at all with those like myself who maintain the tradition, because those like myself do not have any kind of rational argument, but rather a kind of psychological condition. Their expressions must be repressed when they have any impact on reality, cured once they are too weak to respond, or more generally ignored. As another commentator, Richard Legutko, notes, the traditionalists can first be ignored as quaint vestiges of the past. How cute, breeders, there's still those around. That's lovely. How interesting, they watch movies from the 50s. Traditionalists are sort of like the actors at Colonial Williamsburg, sort of quaint, funny that anyone would want to do that, sort of stupid, but nonetheless it's okay. But eventually, the actors at Colonial Williamsburg, traditionalists like myself, must be judged to be dangerous because repressive and assisted, helped into the ash heap of history so that anti-culture can reign supreme in every aspect of life, including education, morals, culture, the family, sex, arts, entertainment, the market, government, and religion as well. Is it any surprise then that we see the anti-culture of arbitrary choice not only mock and devalue, but increasingly attack religious freedom and the religious commitments of those who do not wish to go along with the cultural catechesis? That is, anti-culture is growing fangs. No longer content to ignore us, no longer content to mock us, they wish increasingly to cure us and our children. Respond to that. So, 5 challenges: the permissive thesis, body self-dualism, anti-culture's transgressive revolt, a pervasive but hidden cultural catechesis, and increasingly an aggressive attempt to cure or restrain people who believe as I do. I think you'll have work to do at your round tables. I hope you will. Now, against those 5 challenges, we have a very simple response, which is apparently true in my mind, but apparently weak in its ability to persuade, which is namely the one flesh union. The story of Genesis. Here's a claim I'd like you to consider. I do not believe that we can simply respond to the 5 challenges with an ethic of obligation, with a moralism. That moralism is itself viewed as repressive and arbitrary and in need of a cure. The tisk-tisking is non-responsive in the eyes of our cultural despisers. Instead, we need a fundamental anthropology. We need an account of what we are for, what it is actually good for us to seek and to do. We need a substantive account of the human good. And much like Genesis did not simply provide rules, but instead an instruction in a better, more human way to live. We need a new story, a new cultural script. Now, can I tell you the rest of the story about the trip to Charlotte? You want to hear the end of the story? You think I'm a bad person. Yes, you do. I saw your face. She mouthed the words to me, "You are a bad person." Let me tell you the rest of the story. When we arrived in Charlotte, after 3 hours of a happy voyage, a happy trip, where I explained my lumberjack needs and desires for freedom, Amy told me that I was stupid, that I was never going to become a bear hunter or a lumberjack, and I have in fact never hunted bear or cut down a tree, and that she was not going to give me permission to break up with her. Her response was, "That's not permitted." Or that if I was going to break up with her, I better have a better reason than the one I gave, my freedom to be a lumberjack. Now, since I didn't have a better reason to give other than freedom, she didn't let me break up with her. Then she kissed me in a way that I could not recover from, and we married shortly after. And just a few days ago, celebrated our 24th Valentine's Day together. And she spent the whole day with me, which is good. And this summer we'll have 20 years of marriage, 20 years of having and holding, cleaving only to each other in sickness and in health until death do us part. And an anniversary joined by 5 children here on earth and another 4 in heaven, who I hope will celebrate as well. And I am completely free. Free for excellence. Not merely free to do as I wish, but free for a substantive good. Free for what I am meant to be, what I ought to be. Free to embrace and love the communion of persons for which all persons are made and in which they find their life and joy and happiness and fulfillment. We are made for union. We are made for communion. We are made for covenant. Your task is to figure out how to answer the challenges of our time and explain this freedom, this real freedom, this freedom for excellence to others. Note, not to win arguments. This is not debate points. This is not to feel satisfied that you have the upper hand. That's not enough. We have to offer life and joy and happiness, and we have to be motivated by kindness and goodwill, by sympathy and compassion for the pagans who do not know that we are made for communion and made for union. We have to be motivated by goodwill and love rather than fear or anger, and certainly not by the prudishness of the tisk-tisking. We have so much more to offer than that. We are offering a humanizing and civilizing way, which is the communion of persons. Thank you very much.